Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We are going to discuss how to oral history. So introduction phase real quick. If this is the first webinar you've attended of mine, I am Rachel Christine Woody, and I am the founder and director of Relicura. And overall, I've had 15 plus years of experience in libraries, archives, museums, and cultural heritage institutions. And my background is as a business owner, a consultant, but also author, speaker, and very much a people first advocate. Some housekeeping items. First of all, a link to this recording and all the links that are shared throughout the duration of this webinar will be included in an email that will go out to you tomorrow for all of those who have registered. Links will also be shared in the chat as we go through these together. And this session is pre-recorded. That's so I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you, and we can actively use the chat to do any follow-up questions, additional details, that kind of thing. As we're in the chat, please feel free to share your own examples and resources, your experiences with this particular topic, and any questions you may have. We are using YouTube as our platform to provide these webinars. So you, in order to use the chat, you will need to have a YouTube account and be logged in. Otherwise, please feel free to just email me directly after the webinar. And then the benefit of using YouTube as our webinar platform is that you can expand your viewing window depending on the device that you're on. And there's also the ability to have closed captioning. So just know that those options are available to you. And then please just remember and respect that this content is my particular intellectual property and is subject to copyright. So we have quite an agenda today. While oral history may seem like a smaller topic within the archives, public history world, there are quite a bit of facets to it and different research best practices, that kind of thing. So today's very much going to be an overview of what an oral history process can look like from beginning to end. However, just know that I could teach probably an entire year-long course on this, and that would be just enough time to really give you in depth on all of these things. So just know that there are areas and more detail and deep dives to go into once you get a little bit familiar with the overall sense and shape of doing oral histories. So just to go through the table of contents with you real quick, we'll start out with some good old-fashioned best practices. We will then get into what research and gap analysis looks like when doing oral history interviews. We'll then get into the interviewee criteria and selection, and then moving from that into the interview question creation. We'll spend just a moment on permission paperwork because that is a key area that is important and often either overlooked because it is not as fun to think about and is overlooked, or overlooked because it is overwhelming because you haven't figured it out yet. We'll spend some time on equipment options and setup, including conducting the interview strategies to set both you and your interviewee up for success, and then rounding it out with video editing and transcripts at the end there, and sharing with you some resources so that you can do more detailed research or looking into each of these areas after we're done today. All right, best practices. So there are three main places that I think of to go to for professional organizations and oral history. The first and most obvious one for us in the United States is the Oral History Association. That is where the majority of resources and best practices are that we'll be referencing throughout this webinar. And in fact, there's a resource note with two different resources at the bottom of this slide for you to check out. We'll also have a resource slide at the end that gathers all of these together. So please don't feel like you have to scribble this down real quick. It'll be on the slides at the end. And then once we do have those oral history interviews, there is the work of transcription and access. And for the most part, that usually falls under the domain of the Society of American Archivists and the descriptive practices put in place there. And then the National Council on Public History as well, oral histories, um, as part of their unique nature, can fall very much under the archives practice, but also falls under the public history practice. So we have some different professional organizations that we can lean on and use for the resources that they have available. When thinking about best practices, there's a couple different areas. And so topically, I just want you to be aware of each. First and most obvious is best practices related to how to prepare for and conduct an interview. When most people think about oral history, all they think about is that interview, even though there's much more work both before and after that. The second one I want you to think about is how to preserve an oral history collection. This particular area will most likely fall under the archives professional organization and resources. For the most part, if you're dealing with creating current day oral history interviews, you will need to think about digital preservation. Or if you're working with oral history interviews that have been conducted 10, 20, 50 years ago, you may be dealing with outdated media and you will need to likely migrate those so that you have a digital copy as well. And then, of course, third, and certainly not least here, is how to manage, describe, and provide access to these oral history items, just as you would for any sort of museum or archive collection that would be open for research and public engagement. And for this particular one, you may be falling under the archive side for archives, management, descriptive, access best practices, or you may be falling under that public history or museum studies domain and the best practices that they have available there. The good news is, no matter which field or domain you fall in, many of the best practices are in alignment or reflective of one another. So there's really not a bad one to go with. Just be aware of the different types of best practices that we've listed here. All right, getting into research and gap analysis. And of all of the areas of oral history interviews, the entire cycle, this area is usually forgotten or short-sighted the most. So if you have time to be intentional about creating an oral history project moving forward, this is definitely a big part of what I would like you to spend some thought and time on. So the first part is just considering the topic, right? Usually when we sit down as professionals, we don't say, oh, I want to do an oral history and have no idea what it is that we actually want to interview for. Oftentimes, conducting this oral history interview or interviews is because there's some sort of topic, project, research going on that necessitates doing these interviews. So, with that in mind, when we consider a topic, I want you to also think about what is the mission of your institution. When we're doing oral history interviews housed at an institution, it's usually not just to like go out and just speak to anybody, like whatever you want. Resources are tight, your time and capacity is often limited, and we want to make sure that whatever it is that you're doing project wise, oral history or not, is in alignment with the mission of your particular institution. Next, what are the collecting priorities? So, if you're in charge of the archives, museum, cultural heritage organization, whatever type of collection it is that you are in charge of, what sort of collections do you have and or would be appropriate for your type of collection? This helps to inform what sort of oral history interviews and topics you need to focus on over others. Then, what is the intended output or use? So, again, being very intentional and thinking about what, if you do go out and do these oral history interviews, what's the point? Like, what is the why of you doing those interviews? Sometimes it can be because there's a particular exhibition coming up, and the exhibition focus could use help filling in gaps with some wonderful and rich oral history interviews. Other times there may be some research work that needs to go into a particular topic or historical site, And so, with that, there's the intention and focus. So, have those in mind as well in terms of when you think about oral history interviews, in addition to being in alignment with mission and in scope for your collection, is the output or intended use also something that makes sense for you to do? And then finally, are there historical events, organizations, or other memories that are at risk of being lost when a generation passes away? For many of our organizations, and just for us as human beings in general, there are going to be markers in time as we reach them where looking back on a particular event or looking back on a particular generation's experience is incredibly important to capture before that link is lost and all we have is the written or visual records. So thinking about that as sort of that final piece and external to your institution typically is what are some of the celebrations, memorials, historical events, etc., that need to be captured. All right, once you've done some of that intentional and strategic thinking, the next part to this is going to be the research part. So, researching what exists in your home organization is a great first place to start. This helps you to identify any gaps that are within your specific collection. The next and most obvious one after your organization is going to be any sort of peer organizations. And by what I mean by peer organizations is museums or archives or whomever that have similar type collections to you who may be covering similar topics or geographic area. So if there's a gap in your collection and a gap in theirs, then this is a critical gap to the historical record as a whole. And then, of course, just checking in on national organizations and any other perhaps unconventional organizations that could have their own oral history interviews or other archival or museum type materials that fit with what you're looking for. You will be surprised what makes it out to other organizations that may seem like, oh, this type of material or topic would only ever be in this particular historical society, when in fact there are things that find themselves across the country or in national depository. Um, so also checking in with your community archives or community programs where they may not be formalized as cultural memory workers or as a community archive, but still have their own recorded interviews and stories that may fit in well to the narrative that you're trying to capture and wanting to make sure you're not duplicating that work. And then, of course, review available materials on the topic to hone in on where your oral history project can help contribute. So, being intentional and strategic, continuing that through line, making sure that you're not stepping on toes or reinventing the wheel because nobody's happy when that happens. And that what work you're doing is work that is going to help contribute and fill in gaps versus causing any other sort of harm or duplicative work. So, gap analysis. Where are the gaps in your collection? And then thinking about where are the excluded voices or missing perspectives. Now, for all of our institutions, no matter what size or how long you've been around, there are going to be gaps. And for many of us, just the history of how we've collected as museums, as archives, we know that it has not been a perfect history of collections. So, trying to be more proactive about bringing in those excluded voices and missing perspectives because those are the obvious gaps for our collections currently. And then where are there gaps in the historical record across all record keeping facilities? So thinking about both peer and national organizations related to the particular topic we're focusing on, and also thinking about the other types of historical records, whether it's documents, photographs, audiovisual material, where are there gaps in those types of records where an oral history interview could help fill in and provide some additional historical context and valuable information. Okay, now we're going to get into interviewee criteria and selection. So, based on the research and gap analysis that we covered in the previous section, the next question to answer is, what will your interview focus be? So, depending on the size of your project, this particular focus could contain just one topic or as many as perhaps three topics. I don't typically recommend more than that because then you're moving from an oral history project, something that is contained and has a start and end, to an oral history program, which does not have an end date and is a much different undertaking, will require more investment, and is not the topic for today. So reining in that focus based on the gaps that you found, prioritizing from those gaps what sort of topic or topics you would like to cover. This information is what is going to help you then determine who your interviewees could be. And we do have a resource down here, one of the Oral History Association ones for it's a web guide for doing oral history. So do check out that link for some more information on this particular area. So crafting interviewee criteria. So we've got the research, we've got the gap analysis, we have then selected 1 to 3 topics that we think we may want to focus on. Based on that, what does our interviewee look like? What is the background? What sort of story can they help tell? And that is the criteria we're going to create to help us identify who these interviewees are. So for each of those topics, identify for your potential interviewees what type of criteria they need to meet. During this process, I want you to consider their age, life experiences, their position within their community, etc. And when thinking about age and life experiences, position within the community, it's not that they need to be of a particular age or have a particular set of experiences, but it's more to make sure that for the particular topic you're covering, the people you are looking for actually can speak to that topic. For example, if it's a particular historical event specific to the city that you live in, then naturally the criteria for your interviewees need to be people who lived in your city during the time of that historical event, for example. And then finally, create a selection of 3 to 5 criteria markers so that your selections can meet multiple, if not all, criteria. I do want to emphasize, while you do come up with criteria, it does not need to be a perfect fit, especially if you came up with 5 criteria, for example. If you find interviewees that are meeting like 3 out of the 5 of that criteria, that is still going to be a very valuable and worthwhile oral history interview. So don't want you to think that we need perfection here, but I do want to make sure that you have these things in mind and thought out ahead of time before you start approaching potential interviewees. That saves you time as well as saving and respecting their time. So next part to this, consider the community involved. So this is where we're going to get into some strategy around how to make sure we're not causing more harm in doing oral history work. So interview topics typically lend themselves to specific communities of people who have these shared experiences. When we identify the community group, or sometimes groups plural, present within our particular topics that we're working on, we need to consider whether or not, first of all, if we're a part of that community. As collection and memory workers, the answer typically is that we are not a part of those communities. In fact, it can sometimes be rare. And this is something to make sure that we acknowledge upfront and are aware of, because it is going to change the strategy of how we work with these communities and conduct these oral history interviews. So if you are not a part of the community or communities, plural, that you want to work with to do the oral history interviews, you need to take some additional care and thought into approaching this community. So getting into this ethics part of it, first and foremost, extractive approaches aren't ethical. Extractive approaches for our collections have historically been how our collections have formed. We know now, we know better. And so we need to do repair work, of course, on past practices, but also better work moving forward. And this is part of it. So, with that in mind, when we're approaching these communities to potentially partner with, the imbalance of power in our proposed project needs to be addressed. So, we need to remember that we are coming as representatives from an institution, and that can be quite intimidating and come with a sense of you have the higher power here to determine what happens and how. And that needs to be acknowledged and then balanced out, because quite honestly, it's the community that needs to be centered with the power and the decision making. So, the next point of this, the community will need full and well thought out project information from you in order to make a decision to participate. So, this is partly why we're going to spend so much time and thought on the intentional thought or strategies around what is it that we're doing that research and gap analysis piece, crafting then the interview criteria. You want to show them each of those pieces to show how well thought out your project proposal is thus far. And it gives them the information they need to determine whether or not they are an appropriate fit, first of all, and then second of all, whether they want to join you and help do oral history interviews. And then finally, to keep this in mind, to help with that imbalance of power and to help center the care for the community, we need to make sure that the communities we work with have agency in what they do, how they participate, how they want to show up, that they have power in the decision making of how the project moves forward, what it looks like, and that they're treated as equal partners in all things. This is something that historically has not happened and is what part of what we need to change in balancing that power scale and that power dynamic out, where it's not just us as the institution having all the power, it's us sharing power 50-50 with a community that we wish to work with. All right, honing interviewee criteria with the community. So once you've presented some of the project paperwork, the proposal, and assuming that the community agrees and is interested in working with you, the next step is to present a little bit more in depth the research gap analysis and proposed focus, and then the interviewee criteria that you've created from that, and solicit feedback and insight from the community. This is usually an area of tremendous learning opportunity and an area where it's very important to spend some time in so that you do not make mistakes. For example, when you're doing some of that work ahead of time before you approach the community, if you are not a member of that community, it's very easy to not be aware of insider knowledge from the community, things that may have happened previously, areas where there may be particular sensitivity or trauma that needs to be approached very carefully. And this is where you need to rely on the community as experts in their own history and experience to make sure that what you've found so far is true and accurate, and then what it is that you need to adjust. And so then working with those community partners, once you have a good set of criteria and focus to move forward, the community partners can help you choose members of their community that would be perhaps open and willing to participate and who would be a good fit for your project. So working with the community is critical here, first of all, just for ethics of care, making sure you're approaching the community and being accurate and non-duplicative, but then also they are the best ones to help point you in the right direction for who to interview and who may be the best subjects for this particular interview project. Next up, we're performing research on each of these potential interviewees, and we're identifying what sort of lived experiences they likely or may have that can help fill in the gaps that we've identified previously in the historical record. And then we're going to work with the community to make sure that the selection of interviewee candidates and contact each of them as joint partners. So Once you have that criteria, once you've selected interviewees and have considered how they help fit your focus and could help fill in those gaps, we are next then jointly with our partners reaching out to these potential interviewees to ask if they're interested in participating. And this is another huge area where having the community partnership backing is incredibly helpful, because when you yourself are just trying to essentially cold call potential people in a community to participate in this project, they are understandably going to be very leery and perhaps confused as to why you're contacting them. Whereas when you're contacting them with joint partners and it's clear that this project has been well thought out, then it's a little bit easier to start having those conversations. It's a little bit of a warmer introduction, and you'll be that much more successful in landing interviews with the people and the criteria really that you had hoped to land. All right, question creation. So we are now up to the point where we've selected our interviewees and we have had previous thoughts on what sort of gaps they can help fill. We are now going to translate that into what it will look like as an interview guide. And an interview guide is essentially a full set of questions for a specific interviewee. There's going to be some basic biographical data, typically at the top, and that's to help you as the question creator, but also you as the oral history interviewer, to help have a snapshot sense of who it is in front of you, what the context is of their life experiences, and how they may be able to help answer the questions moving forward, as well as any follow-up questions you may have. And then consider each interviewee and how their story helps to support the topics of focus. So some of our questions may be similar and have overlaps. You can see a through line in that particular topic of focus. And other areas, we're going to want to ask more specific questions for that particular interviewee. So having a chance to consider what are the broad but also very specific questions we want to ask our interviewees with our question or focus in mind. I want you to keep in mind for question creation that we want to make sure all of our questions are open-ended, and that means that we're not asking questions that could be answered by yes, no, or maybe. Open-ended questions are also a great way to get that person's particular sense or recollection versus asking them for a factual answer. The next part that I would like you to keep in mind and that I often see overlooked is context setting. When we're asking questions, and especially when we're wanting interviewees to open up, it is sometimes helpful to, in our question, acknowledge the context up front of whatever it is that we're asking. For example, when I am speaking with somebody and there's a particular event they were in or a particular accomplishment that they've had, I will use part of that context or that question setup to say, okay, Jim, when you were experiencing this event in the 1960s, you were around 13 years old, and we know from the last question that you experienced some of this. Could you tell me some more about that, or how did that feel? So helping Jim in my imaginary scenario with some context of how old he was, what event I'm looking for, what years, and that I'm looking for his thoughts, feelings, and recollections about that specific thing versus asking him to just tell me about that event. The difference between those two questions are the first one very much centers his experience and his story, his memory, whereas the second one is something that I could plug into a Google search and get this like an answer for. It would not be Jim's answer because it would not be Jim's experience or memory, but it would be the answer to what that event was about. And then, of course, the follow-up questions. So sometimes when we're question creating, we know that there will likely be a follow-up and may include it as part of that, like a two-parter kind of question. Other times, though, there's natural follow-ups that come up based on what the interviewee has said to us previously. If there are follow-up questions that you would like to continue going down the trail of, That's definitely something I encourage. Other times, though, there may be a follow up question where, depending on how long the interview has already gone or what the focus of your interview is, it may not be appropriate or it may not be good manners to ask some of the follow up questions. For example, some of the rookie mistakes that I tend to see happen here in the follow up questions is that instead of keeping the topic of focus in mind for your interview, there may have been something that came up that may seem like interesting, but in like an interpersonal or perhaps gossipy kind of way, or perhaps just extremely personal. And if it has nothing to do with that particular focus, you have no business asking about it. So please keep that in mind. That is a marker of professionalism. And it's one thing that just like I do not like because it really does um, not only sort of stain what it is, the work that you're doing, but it could also severely insult or hurt the person you're asking these questions of. So just please be incredibly mindful that your follow ups are topic appropriate. Okay, question flow. So there's creating the questions, there's leaving some room for follow up questions or naturally flowing into a different topic. I want us to also think about the question flow and how to set it up in the best way so that you're not hopping around question wise or topic wise, and it can seem more natural and more comfortable both to you as the interviewer, but also to the interviewee. So when we're putting these questions together, the opening questions are going to be 1 to 2 questions that are meant to get some information, but also these questions' job is to help warm up and help make the interviewee feel as comfortable as possible. They're going to usually be very nervous and sometimes very intimidated by the process they're about to go through. So asking them some warm, opening questions, seemingly simple, but something that they could really wax poetic about if they want to. Something to get them excited, something to get them warmed up, help them feel comfortable with you as well as the topic what they're about to talk about. Also, then getting into there's the warm up opening question, getting into some beginning questions. And when I typically work on an interview flow, I start with beginning questions that help to set the scene. So, what are some of the historical events we're going to be talking about? What are some of the first experiences I want us to touch on? Because we're going to get into detail of those things later. So, putting those towards these not opening questions, but very beginning early questions. As you move your way through, sometimes it makes sense to go into more detail of particular items. Other times it makes sense to start moving towards broader questions. What are the broader implications of what we just talked about, the particular event or the particular person? And then leading our way towards these ending questions. So now that we've gone through this flow of conversation of a particular event or recollection, what are some ending questions to help bring some finality or some perspective from the interviewee that is specific to them, but on the topics that you've been talking about? And then for the closing questions, we usually have 1 or 2 in there that help to bring closure and again bring in hopefully a bit of that lightheartedness, that comfort and reassurance to the interviewee that they have done a good job, that we're just about done here. And we even in our particular work that we do with oral history interviews, will include a question that we preface with, okay, that was the end of our formal questions, the questions we've prepared for you today. Is there anything that we didn't ask that we should have? Or is there anything that you'd like to share with us? And sometimes there's not. Sometimes the interview was incredibly thorough. The interviewee is feeling very comfortable and confident with the answers that they've given. But a good other 50% of the time, if not more, the interviewee realizes that it's the end of the interview. There's a bit of relief, but also that's when things tend to come to mind of like, oh, I want to make sure we mention this before we're done. So sort of capturing and sort of triggering that moment with them so that you can make sure you've captured everything before you're on your way out the door and they're trying to tell you about things that you really wish you would have recorded with them before you were done. Okay, focusing back in on ethics for this particular section and prioritizing the well-being of the interviewee. This particular portion is incredibly important from my perspective and is covered in some of the literature, but in my opinion, not nearly enough or as prioritized. So we're going to spend a couple minutes here with the ethics. Oral historians, at least traditionally, tended not to send out their questions ahead of time. This was mostly due down to strategy. If you were to send the questions ahead of time, usually people like to do their homework and write out their answers, and you lose some of that spontaneity or that natural storytelling. So stylistically, it's something that oral historians want to avoid because they want the more natural storytelling. However, with the oral history interviews that we are doing and certainly moving forward as we're trying to fill in historical gaps and working with communities that have been mistreated, past and present, or have trauma around the particular topics and in the community, we need to be incredibly careful and center their sense of safety and well-being. And this is where sending questions ahead of time is the ethical thing to do and is something where I have switched my practice to. If we are working with these types of communities, if there is any chance that there may be some trauma around things, I am sending questions ahead of time so that there are no surprises, so that the interviewees that we're working with have a chance to think about those questions, and if they want to answer them, it gives them time to connect with their therapist if they are working with a mental health professional. And it gives them a chance to communicate to us as the interviewers what they are comfortable answering or not. And it gives us a chance to change the questions if we need to. What I have found so far is that usually there's not a lot of question changing or taking away, but that it has given our interviewees the benefit of getting some support ahead of time on answering some of these questions that may not seem like tough questions on paper, but come with incredibly tough emotions and recollections. So that is a major, this is why we send questions ahead of time. It also helps in these other facets. So anyone who may need a memory aid, so thinking of some of our interviewees who are more advanced in age or who may be experiencing some neuro atypicalness, and so having that ability to have that memory prompt and get a little bit more comfortable with the questions ahead of time can make all the difference with their sense of confidence and comfort. Also, from an accessibility perspective, those who may need access to the questions ahead of time in a non-auditory form, it gives them a chance to get the tools they need to have in place for us to have this conversation together. And then for our last point, which I know we started with at the beginning of this slide, but just to reiterate, those who may have trauma and need to emotionally prepare or make the decision not to include the question. So several reasons as to why providing the questions ahead of time is part of our ethics of care. All right, permission paperwork, everybody's favorite, just kidding. So permission paperwork is essentially getting permission from the interviewee to, first of all, record them, and second of all, usually making that recording accessible. It, for those of you who are in an archives or cultural heritage organization, this will look fairly similar to a deed of gift. It essentially is getting their permission and getting the copyright to the interview that you're conducting, and that you're getting their permission to make it available in whatever forms you plan to make it available. So there is a resource I want to point out down here from Baylor, which is like one of the places for oral history resources. And they have a whole little resource on preparing legal documents. So I recommend checking that out. Also, if you're with an institution that has access to a lawyer, running any sort of paperwork like this by that lawyer is highly recommended, including your deed of gift, including this particular interview permission form. Always run it by your legal counsel. And then make sure when you are bringing this form with you that you explain what it is to the interviewee, both at the time when you contact the interviewee, and then again when you're sitting in front of them asking them to sign it. Again, they're going to be overwhelmed and a little intimidated typically. So sending that permission form ahead of time is usually good practice, but also walking through it with them and using common language to help explain why it's there and what it's for. Okay, equipment options. So there's a lot of different type of equipment out there that you could use. And there are now 4K cameras that you can go out and buy. We do have one of them for Relicura. We also have this particular Panasonic video camera. And the reason why I have this particular one up here is that I have used several different cameras over the last 10 years. And this particular make and model has been the most robust and longevity that I have found. It's also got a little bit of a nicer price point as $400 versus like $3,000. And it really is just a great camera to take into the field and do these oral history interviews. It's somewhat lightweight, easy to use, fairly excellent video quality, just short of 4K really. And what's nice about this one versus the 4K that we ended up finding out in the field is that the 4K needs so much extra lighting because of the higher video quality that we could just not provide that sort of high quality video lighting in the field. So using this little camera, it ended up having a better picture, having better video quality, and it's just a great workhorse of a camera. So that's what we recommend. We do not have a deal with Panasonic at all, but this is the camera we use. So take that with a grain of salt, I guess. And then in terms of audio recording, yes, the camera on the previous slide does have like a natural like place where it can take in audio. It's not great though, unless it's like right in front of the interviewee. So I highly recommend using lavalier mics, essentially little lapel clipping mics for you as the interviewer as well as for the interviewee. So this particular set, also around $400, has the two mic setup. So you and the interviewee, if you're doing a one-on-one, as well as the mic receiver. And this is the portion that plugs into your video camera that will marry the audio with the video as you're recording. You don't have to do it that way, but it does make your life easier later on, which we'll get into in just a few slides. So this is the particular set that we are using now, and I love it. Lightweight, USB-C charge, I think. Great lavalier clip mics. So, and again, not being sponsored by Rode or anybody, but these are the ones that we like. And then think about accessories. So it really doesn't matter what brand for these type of accessories, but they do tend to be forgotten if you've never done oral history interviews in the field before. So first of all, tripod. Please get yourself a tripod. Otherwise, you're going to be using tables and books to try and balance the camera on. And get a tripod that has the little liquid leveler on the tripod so that you can make sure that the camera is actually level and not askew. It's really hard to tell when you're actually looking at the little camera windows. So getting the tripod with the little liquid leveler is what I recommend. Also, if you are doing oral histories in the field versus at your office or studio, travel chargers and extra cords are always good, and getting a travel bag for your equipment to help store all of the different stuff you may need, and multiple storage cards. So each camera, or excuse me, well, yeah, each camera is still accurate. Any camera you have will have at least one, sometimes two storage card areas. You will need at least one to do recordings. And depending on how much storage they could each have on them, you may need multiple, as well as if you're doing multiple oral history interviews and you're not going to have a chance to download the content from the cards, getting bigger ones or extra ones is always helpful. So I usually have at least a few with me, and I try and get the highest storage available possible so that you're not worrying while you're doing an interview as to how much space you have left before the storage runs out on the camera. Equipment setup. So this is part of what helps to make the interviewee feel comfortable, but this is also what helps to make the interview that you are producing a good quality visual once you are done, audio and visual for that matter. So first of all, consider the lighting, enough and too much. So if you're doing something indoors or if it's outdoors in shade, if the person is in the shade or you can't see them well while you are in person, then it's going to be even worse on camera. So you want to make sure that there is light facing the person and not behind them. Do not put interviewees in front of a window. Also, there can be too much lighting. So this was part of the problem when we were thinking about using the 4K cameras. We needed so much lighting that it was blinding and intimidating. So too much lighting, sometimes from a visual perspective on the product is not great, but certainly for interviewee comfort is not great. Next, set up the camera slightly off center from the interviewee so that it isn't distracting. Again, because they're already going to be fairly uncomfortable because there's you and a camera and other things going on behind you, but in front of them. It can be so intimidating staring down straight ahead at that camera. So putting it just next to you as the interviewer helps the interviewee focus on you as the primary because you are having a conversation with them. And this eventually, within 1 to 2 questions, will fade into the background for your interviewee, and it will feel more like a conversation for them versus camera and then maybe you on the side. Also, when we're thinking of framing the interviewees and to help again for their comfort, but also a good visual, is to keep the framing from the waist up and to basically frame it where they have enough room to like gesticulate, depending on like whether they use their hands a lot to talk, or sometimes if the interview is long, they may need to like shift positions in the chair. So you want to make sure you're giving them enough room so that if and when they do that, they are not all of a sudden off camera. And you have to move the camera or move them because that interrupts flow, of course. So being generous with this, with the shape, but also honed in enough where it's not entirely distracting and the interviewee person is this big. It's a fine balance. We usually have to mess with it every time we set it up. All right, if you are using a freestanding mic instead of the lavalier, the little clip mics, then having that freestanding mic close to the interviewer and the interviewee is going to be important. Usually keeping them within the two people within 6 feet of each other, but within 3 feet of the mic. Also, it's always a good idea to have a backup camera and backup audio device running just in case. We have a 2-camera, 2-audio system. The 2-audio one is the lavalier mics, which we rely on for our primary audio because they're so good. But things happen, and so we also have one of those Zoom recorders, not related to Zoom meetings, that are great little recorders on their own and can sometimes be used instead of the lavalier audio. Also, have at least 2 locations where you're saving these files just in case, and especially if you're on the road. And then as you start editing, making sure that you have an original file that you don't touch, and then create a working file that you're working with, editing, etc. So just a little bit of some good digital preservation best practice here. And then, as a note, when in a pinch, smartphones can be a good backup for video and audio. Quite honestly, the quality of our smartphones is often on par with current video camera quality, especially if you're working with the more handheld versus 4K kind of cameras. Um, our smartphones are quite honestly are amazing. So you could use those in some instances, and I would not be able to tell the difference. Also, when thinking about doing in person interviews and acknowledging that we all just went through a pandemic together, that sometimes interviews in person aren't possible, whether it's pandemic, geographic distance, failing health of someone, etc. There could be so many reasons. And so setting up interviews remotely is also entirely possible. And using platforms like Zoom, this time talking about the Zoom platform, can definitely help and is just as valid as an oral history recording as doing it in person with a camera. And in fact, OHA, the Oral History Association, created a remote interviewing resource during COVID that is a great little guide to help walk you through what that could look like. All right, finally, conducting the interview, right? We just covered, I think, 4 or 5 different topics that usually get glazed over in other oral history programs that are arguably more important than doing the actual interview, but this is definitely the part that gets the most attention. So, as you sit down, you've got the equipment set up, you've had this prior conversation with the interviewee, they've seen the questions, you've done the paperwork. Now you're getting ready to actually do the interview. First up, you need to set the stage for what they can expect, identify their points of agency, and make them as comfortable as possible. Like, this is your number one priority, in addition to making sure the camera's recording, which hopefully you have a second person to do that. Making them comfortable is going to set you up for better success and a more enjoyable experience for your interviewee and for you too, for that matter. So typically what I like to do is let them know, like, hey, there's this camera here. It'll seem a little intimidating, but within a couple of questions, it will fade into the background. This is going to be a very conversational tone. You can start and stop at any point. If you'd like to do your answer over again, we can definitely do that. If you would like something cut out after you've said it, you can let us know now, or you can even let us know later when we're editing. So identifying all of the different points of which they can stop, they can ask for things, they know what's coming next. All of these things are critically important to making sure that they feel comfortable and safe. Also, as you're going through doing the interview, making eye contact, smiling, nodding to indicate that you are listening are also incredibly important. It is, when you're doing oral history interviews, it can be incredibly exhausting as the interviewer, even though you're not the one doing all of the talking, because you are keeping several different things in mind: camera equipment, yourself following the questions, maybe a follow-up question, as well as keeping track and keeping tabs on how is the interviewee doing. So this is extra important for the interviewee to make sure that they feel and know that they are being listened to. Otherwise, they're going to start self-censoring and start shortening the answers that they give you because they have interpreted, maybe rightly, that you are not quite engaged or as interested. And also, because this is meant to be an interview and not a conversation, even though we're keeping conversational tone, we are not speaking as much because this interview is not about us. And so doing those physical cues can help the interviewee know that even though I'm not giving like a verbal, like, oh, yeah, because those, for other editing reasons, are very distracting. Giving them that physical smile, nod, indicate that you're listening is really all that they need and is so important for you to do. Also, emotions are gonna happen. Sometimes they are happy emotions. It's good. Have a laugh, like laugh with them. There's also going to be sad emotions, and especially if you're covering a particular topic, event, lived experience that has some trauma with it for them and perhaps also for you, empathy is incredibly important here. And in order to help the well being of your interviewee and also just to be a good human, you need to be in that moment with them. So if they start crying, I am a crier too. So I will start crying too, and we will just have a good cry together. And it is completely okay to take that moment, camera be damned, interview paused, whatever, and be with them. Be with them in that moment because they need to get through it, and you should be with them to help them get through that. So just know that it is okay for human moments to take that time and to show that emotion with them. And as they're going through it, usually there's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying. And they're trying to rush through it or trying to get some privacy because it's you and a camera, which is understandable. So being reassuring and saying it's okay, this we've paused, we will cut this out. Let's take a moment, like it's totally okay. Just a lot of affirmation and reassurance here. Also, keep in mind, depending on who you're interviewing and what you're interviewing about, that they may need breaks, whether that is a mental emotional break or like a bio needs break. Keep in mind how long it's been. Keep in mind how you're interpreting that they're doing, and occasionally offer, like, hey, would you like to take a break right now? Would you like to get a sip of water? Shall we stretch our legs? Just taking that moment to pause and ask them, do they need something? And then a note for you as the interviewer, take notes if it helps your brain. If you are a note taker, I am too. I usually let the interviewee know, like, hey, you will see me taking profuse notes. It's because I am loving what you're sharing. I want to make sure I get this down. I want to make sure I do a follow-up question, things like that. And that will indicate to them, again, because they're looking at you for reassurance that you making notes is a good thing and not because you're doodling or bored or whatever. And please, for the love of God, write notes on paper so that they can see it, especially if you're interviewing people that tend to be in an older demographic. If you're taking notes on your phone, even if you tell them you're taking notes on your phone, psychologically it is a major turnoff for people. So do not take notes on your phone. Write them out the old-fashioned way if at all possible. To complete the ethics of care for this particular section, I just want to reiterate that your number one responsibility here is the comfort and safety of your interviewee. And so everything you do from the setup to the execution of to the post-production, all of your decisions should be made with their well-being in mind. Video editing. So this is an area where we could have several classes on, but I do want to give you some pointers to get started, and then perhaps we can go into depth at a future webinar. Video editing software. It is getting so much easier now, and there are several products that are good ones to choose from. The ones that we typically use are Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere Pro. And in the end, because I want to talk about video style so you can see how it really doesn't matter which tool you choose. When we're thinking of oral history interviews and video editing, we want to keep it minimal. This is a historical record. There should not be a lot of like fancy flourishes, or like we're not making a documentary. The footage could be in a documentary later, but we are not currently making a documentary. So keep it minimal. Also, when we're doing the video editing, there's going to be the natural, like the start that's not the official start and the end that's not the official end, where buttons were pushed, etc. So there's clean cuts top and bottom that we typically do for our oral history interviews. And then if there's any other sort of pauses, any content that needs to be removed, somebody coughs, for example, or if they wanted to start their answer over again, if you do happen to take a bio break, like all of those things will need to be cut out. Next, The connection or disconnection of different audio and or video tracks from your different backup devices. So if something happened and your lavalier mic is staticky or wasn't great and you need to swap out for the other audio, having video software to help disconnect the video from the audio that was put together is helpful, and then subbing in the different either video, audio, or both in certain cases. That is probably the most used editing function that we do, aside from like cleaning the beginning and the end. And then just any other sort of polish. Usually for our oral history projects, there might be a title slide explaining who it is in the interview, what the interview is for, perhaps a date. And then there's usually an outro slide that just helps to signify, okay, that was the end, or like a thank you card, that kind of thing. So that's it. That's the editing that we do. And that is the editing that is like your core thing to focus on when you're thinking oral history interviews. So, with that in mind, the minimalist style, you don't need a lot of flourishes or heavy duty software to help get that done. This particular screenshot is from Final Cut Pro. It's what we're using currently. And so you can see the import of files. Down here, we have the actual video clip from one of our previous webinars. You can see the audio down here, the little dashes, the video, and the snapshots as it goes through. So we top and tail with the slides. If we wanted to disconnect the audio, it's a very easy like right click kind of function. We can cut out audio, add it in. We could insert different title cards. So there are some very basic, very easy things that we can do without having to touch or know what some of all of these other buttons are. If you love this kind of stuff, great, go for it. But also if you're intimidated by this kind of stuff, just know that you only need to learn like 3 things and you can do it. So final thing here, there are dozens of good software and dozens of good software tutorials available specifically on YouTube. So when you're searching for a particular function that you need to do, perhaps you're not sure on how to swap out the audio, for example, plug into the search the name of the software you are using and then the particular use or function that you're trying to do, and you will find dozens, if not hundreds, of different videos of people walking you through using that software, doing that specific action. So you don't need a training class for this. You really just need a few minutes with YouTube to help see a bit of a show and tell on the particular feature or issue you're having. Transcripts. So transcripts, we have the option of the computer or AI generated. For us, we're currently using Otter AI. And then there's human generated. Up until recently, we've not had very good computer/AI generated options, but of course, since COVID and Zoom meetings and us being better about thinking on how to make things more accessible to everyone, tools have gotten better. And so we typically recommend a hybrid approach. That's what we do. We'll generate the transcript first using an audio file and Otter AI. So it's an AI generated transcript. It does the best it can. It is not 100% perfect. It's going to struggle with different vocal intonations. It's going to struggle with different accents. It's going to struggle if there's any sort of background noise competing with the other people noises. And sometimes it can struggle with who's talking. Typically, it can identify that there's 2 different people, but if the vocal tones are similar or if there's some other sort of audio discrepancy, it can sometimes be like, oh no, it's all this one person talking. So keep that in mind, which is why then we have the human approach, not only to make sure our names, places spelled correctly, but to make sure that just in general, like the English language in this case, whichever language you're doing it in, is actually accurate as a human reads it versus what the AI thought it might be. So usually there's a generate it first through AI, which is a great first round, get it written out without you having to type it. And then as a human being, having someone go through it, listen to it, and doing some of the corrections and revisions is a good second draft approach. We use Otter AI. This is a screenshot from one of our interviews. Parts of what I like about Otter AI is first that it has the ability to collaborate with some of your different team members. So once we get the transcript generated, multiple different members of my team can come in, make notes, do like edit the actual transcript or put in some highlighted or copied notes. We get also this great little metadata up here at the top in terms of what the interview is, when it was loaded, what's the duration. Summary keywords, which I kind of love, are very helpful key pointers in terms of like, what is this interview about? Like, we know it was roughly about Birmingham and the civil rights era of the 1960s. But in addition to that, what is this interview actually about? And then the fun little speaker's note of how much was the interviewee, which naturally should be the majority of it, and how much of the speaking was the interviewer. So great interface, can do multiple collaboration, and then also down here, playing, speeding up, skipping back, skipping forward, easy editing with pencil inline as you're listening to it. It's while the AI is not perfect in its generation of the transcript, it is one of the easier tools to work with when you're doing that editing process. So that's what we're using for now. I would love to hear if anybody else is using something that is equally awesome or even better. So as we think about editing as the actual action versus tool or software, the transcript review and editing is going to be a multi-round process, or at least it should be as you're doing a project. Checking for names, checking for events, checking for special phrases, making sure that those are accurate. And then again, thinking about that ethics of care and centering the well-being of our interviewees. We want to provide a transcript to the interviewee for review. So this is before we finalize things. This is when we've done the first little cleaning of edits, video-wise and transcript-wise, and we're having them take a look at the whole of the interview and making sure that they're okay with it. This is, again, something that didn't used to be done by oral historians, again, because they didn't want people to be like, oh, please take this out, or I say too much, or what have you. They didn't want them to change their minds. But given what we know now, given that we need to be better at taking care of the people that we're working with, this is now an area of policy where we just provide them a transcript before anything is finalized for our project to make sure that they're still 100% okay with what's making it into the historical record. Resources. So we've made it through the bulk of the content. Thank you for that marathon and joining me on it. Here are the resources, some of which we mentioned on specific slides, others that are just great resources to check out as you're starting to get to know the oral history process, and especially if you're growing an oral history program of your own. There's a couple different publications to check out depending on what area of the oral history part you would like to get to know more of. And then, of course, the Baylor University Institute for Oral History. This is like the vanguard of standards, and they've done a tremendous job providing great free resources for everybody, including the legal documents and the transcription style guides. So if you ever have any questions or need anything, both Baylor and the Oral History Association are great first stops for you for this type of work. This concludes our official webinar. We have some questions coming up, but please feel free to email me, rachel@relicura.com. And if you're interested in the other webinars we've done so far, you can always go to the YouTube channel with the handle @relicura. A quick thank you before we get into questions. And we got a few specific ones. So I'll go through these and then we'll have a slide card up for us to finish up questions in the chat. So question number 1, and I provided some of the backstory because I loved it. While in Alaska in 2003, we had the opportunity to visit a dear old Alaskan friend who was a commercial fisherman in the late 1940s up until our visit in 2003. I had taken my little recorder and we had an amazing conversation about the old days of fishing across the Cook Inlet from Kenai. I hope it's Kenai. If not, please tell me how to say it. This kind of individual set net fishing is almost a thing of the past now. And then I broke out the questions specifically, and we'll get to them in a second. I have 6 hours of recording his fascinating and colorful experiences, but how to condense and have it digitized has been my conundrum. Taking the spoken word and making it digital so I can edit and have it as a printed story. I will retain his words and his voice simply because of the inflections, but want to take it to the next level for a written story. Although this is not the usual oral history, an aside, I did take a day class from Oregon's state oral historian in the 1990s. But feel this casual conversation deserves to be documented as it speaks to the old days, with not only of Alaska, but fishing. I'm hoping this oral history class will shed some light on how to preserve his memories and experiences. So, love the story. First of all, thank you for sending me such a lovely. There was some more of it. I tried to condense, so forgive my editing, but thank you for that and the great questions. First of all, any sort of oral documentation, especially if it's recounting experiences and chronicling history, can be called an oral history. There's no, like, you don't need an official button or to have taken an official course to have this type of record be considered an oral history. So I just want to affirm that the work that you have done definitely counts. And I want to affirm the, no matter what you do with the recordings, digitization, printing, written word, etc., the desire to retain his original words and voice simply because of the inflections. I just want to reemphasize for everybody that there is so much information and so much value in hearing the spoken word and in seeing a person telling their story. So even if we could get the transcript, or even if we could do something that altered where we no longer had access to hearing, in this case, his voice, or seeing him tell this story, there's quite a bit of contextual information that would be lost then, as well as a bit of the magic, right? Like the reason why, well, the first reason why we do oral history interviews is for the historical record, but the second reason why we do them is because we enjoy them and it's connecting with fellow human beings. So keeping the human aspects in there, for example, his inflections, the way he tells the story, the way he may gesture when he tells the story, all of those are incredibly valuable, either from historical contextual information or from a human connection perspective, past and present. So now that I have given you some thoughts on what you didn't ask about, let's get to your actual questions. So I did have a couple answers on this one. So if you would like to get the recording digitized, because I imagine if it was in 2003, if you were in the program I was in at the time, it was microcassettes we were using. But regardless, finding a digitization vendor is usually a good way to go, especially if it's a finite amount of material that you have. Digitization vendors have all sorts of antique equipment and things set up where it's much easier for them to just very quickly and efficiently digitize your recordings. So it's a good first solution you could do. And or if you want to learn how to do it by yourself, or if you're worried about having someone else do it, researching and acquiring the tech that you need to digitize is also an option. So again, this is where YouTube is a great resource on figuring out what it is that you need. And then if you need like the antique technology to play the cassettes, eBay is usually where all of us archivists go and get our antique tech to do our own digitization. So I recommend checking out eBay or one of your local repositories to see if they have what you need. And then in terms of transcripts, you could generate it that in our transcript section, how we talked about it. But either way, I just I'm so thrilled that you submitted that question, and there's several different options you can use in order to make it digital or make it into a written story. So I'm just so glad that you're continuing to enjoy that moment or moments that you had with your friend. Next question. Which are the best transcribing software apps / programs for turning audio files into written documents? So this is definitely going to change every year, especially for the next few years, because there's always bigger and better products. The leaders for the moment in the AI pack tend to be Otter AI or Rev.com. Those, at least in my particular circle of oral historian type folks, those are the two I hear the most. Again, as we discussed in the transcription section, they're not perfect, but they do go a long way in saving that initial labor of typing everything up. So my advice is to test out the different AI type products or programs to see how you like them. Many of them tend to offer like first 30 minutes of recording free or something, like some sort of trial, so that you can get a sense of how accurate is it for your material. Do you like the interface? Because really it's those are the two things for you to keep in mind in terms of what sort of programs to use. Just remember vocal intonation, accents, and other audio factors can create either greater challenges for the particular AI tool. So, depending on what type of content you have, etc., I do heavily recommend you test it out, both for whether you like it or not in terms of use, but also in terms of how well it does with your type of content. Next question. How do you keep an elderly person or anyone on track when they start remembering and go off topics that don't relate to what you asked? Just follow them to a new topic or gently say something to refocus or and I am so glad you asked this question because this is part of the ethics of care in prioritizing the interviewee and their comfort and safety. And this counts. So this particular area is one to navigate with great care. We don't want them to feel embarrassed or feel shameful because that will shut them down. It also causes emotional harm to them. And so it's going to require a balance of patience as well as gently leading them back to the particular topic. And sometimes, if you've done sort of the gentle leading back a couple times and you're not quite getting the answer, that usually indicates that for whatever reason, either cognitively or otherwise, they're not able to answer that question at that time. And so it's time for you as the interviewer to move to the next question. When people are experiencing some cognitive decline or interference, there are some areas of their life or their story that they can tell so easily and they feel so comfortable in. And there are other areas where they know it's there, but they can't get there. And so that is usually when you start hearing them either talk in circles but never getting through, or they start talking and then completely go into a different topic, um, just because they can't get to the particular topic that you asked for. So paying attention to what they can and can't answer at that time is going to be your greatest asset in determining whether you can gently refocus them or if you need to move you both on. So, yes, and then just to keep in mind affirmation and redirection. So, helping them feel not embarrassed when you're bringing them back for a redirect. So, usually, what I do if they've told me a story that I didn't necessarily ask about, I usually affirm, thank you so much for sharing that. And then, can we learn more about this? So, not being like, oh, okay, thanks, and being mean about it, or also not saying, okay, well, but that's not what I asked. Could you answer this? Like, we don't want to do any of that. We just want to make sure that we are grateful and affirm what they have shared with us. And then, if we can, just a gentle, could you tell us more about this? Could we explore this part more? And if they can, they will. And if they can't, then you move them to the next question. All right, those were the official sent in questions ahead of time. Thank you so much for those. And we'll leave this running for a few more minutes. I know this was a long webinar with a lot of content for us to cover, but I was thrilled with how popular this particular topic is. And I'm just so glad that you joined us for this one. And if it continues to be popular, we can get into some more detail with some of the more technical aspects. So anyway, that's all from me. We'll leave this up for a couple more minutes, but thank you so much, and we'll see you next month.